Clive Priddle, and I'm here with the current. Delighted to introduce to you today Mike Duncan. Mike is the author and creator of two unbelievably successful podcasts, The History of Rome and the one he's currently working on called Revolutions. He is the author of The Storm Before the Storm, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which was a New York Times bestseller. He's a history enthusiast from all periods, and we're very pleased to have you with us today, Mike, and to be broadcasting this episode just in front of Independence Day weekend in America. So welcome, and great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
So I want to start by talking about your first book, The Storm Before the Storm, and get your take on America. Because although The Storm Before the Storm is a history of ancient Rome, you did some very interesting things. Firstly, you sort of crowdsourced the era for the book from your podcast audience, didn't you? Explain a little bit how that worked.
Well, it was not so much. It does come out of The History of Rome, and The History of Rome was the first podcast I did, which was a complete, beginning to end narrative history of the Roman Empire and Roman civilization. And when I finished that book, or when I finished that podcast, there was this one particular era that I had gotten stuck in my head a little bit, which is the era sort of after Rome had become this major power in the Mediterranean, after they defeated Hannibal and they defeated the Carthaginians and emerged as the one real superpower in the Mediterranean world. But before they made the transition to Julius Caesar and, the autocracy, the true autocracy of like the Roman Empire to Augustus and then beyond. And there were a lot of, at a minimum, echoes, if not parallels, if not things that rhymed, in terms of what the Roman Republic was facing, having emerged as this lone superpower in the Mediterranean world, and a lot of what the United States was dealing with. Just as I turned on the news and walked around in my own streets and talked to people, there was enough there that was going on that after I was done and an opportunity presented itself that, maybe I could write a book about something, it was one of the things that I mentioned. Like, there is this one particular era of Roman history that is like incredibly fascinating, and I would love the opportunity to go back and retell that story again. And that was the impetus for what became The Storm Before the Storm, which the storm was the destruction of the Republic and the collapse into autocracy. The Storm Before the Storm was everything that happened 2 generations before that cataclysmic event that actually set everything in motion in the first place, which is the thing, again, that concerns me as a historian, yes, but also as a citizen of the United States in the 21st century.
Yeah, the book really does put your teeth on edge because, as you say, you're 2 generations ahead of a revolution of sorts in ancient Rome when the imperial era begins and the republic ends. Mm-hmm. And it's an incredibly interesting and rather under-examined piece of the whole history of ancient Rome, which the podcast covers. But this little slice, it doesn't get a lot of attention usually. And the building blocks for collapse are really a fascinating aspect of your book. It's amazing, and a lot of reviewers picked up on the similarities with the present. Now, we published the book in 2017, I think.
That sounds right.
And
that was now 417 years ago in real time. So 2017, that sounds right.
According to the parallels, we have to wait 2 generations before the American Republic collapses. But in the 3 years since, how do you feel we're doing here in terms of accelerating towards the collapse?
Ha 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 ha. When I was writing the book, so I was finishing the book in 2016, which is I pitched the book, let's say, and I think I pitched it for the first time in 2015. I had the idea for it, back when I was doing the show itself. Like the episodes that were sort of the germinal point for the book was probably 2008. Maybe is when I was writing those, and I was like, "Oh boy, I don't like some of this." And then so I was finishing the book in 2016, and there was this recurring joke on social media of people telling me I had to write the book faster, and I had to write the book faster because things were accelerating. And I was hoping that I was writing a prescient look forward of things that we could maybe keep an eye out for in the future. Like things are starting. I'm not comfortable with some of the things that are happening politically in the United States. And the book itself, I mean, just to be clear, it's a book about Roman history. Like it's a 50-year chunk of Roman history. I'm not sitting there doing like comparing and contrasting to the modern age. I'm just telling you what happened in the past. But then by the time 2016 rolls around, I started to feel like, well, events are catching up now very quickly to what I was hoping would be prescient. And then by the time the book came out, I was like, oh my God, I hope that things don't go so fast that the book is outdated by the time, it comes out in the end. Because a lot of what the opening, like especially the opening chapter, like the very first chapter about Tiberius Gracchus and the fight over the Lex Agraria, which is simply a reform bill that was going to redistribute land, because over the course of about 100 years, the senatorial aristocracy had really started gathering up more and more of the available land in Italy, and a lot of the small independent farmers who had been the political and cultural backbone of the Roman Republic were starting to be pushed off their land, and they were starting to become these sort of these landless peasants. And it was transforming the economics and the cultural side of the Republic, and it was starting to grate on the political side. And so Tiberius Gracchus is going to propose basically just land redistribution. Let's take some of the land from the rich and give it to the poor, in the simplest, just to put that in the simplest terms possible. And there was enormous pushback to this from the aristocracy. They did not want to give any of their land to the poor. And so what happened in 133 BC was a contest between Tiberius Gracchus and his more and his populist supporters, and a conservative faction inside the Senate, where they each started pushing the limits of what was politically acceptable, right? And what had been the rules that governed things before started to break down. And there's this entire concept in Roman history of mos maiorum, which is to do things in the way of the ancestors. That's sort of a rough way to translate that. And they had always, and because they didn't really have a written constitution, there wasn't some document that they could go to and say, this is the Constitution, this is the rules of order. Everything was done kind of by unwritten agreement. And what begins with the Gracchi is a breakdown of all of those unwritten rules of behavior and all of those unwritten rules of conduct, which we need to have those unwritten norms in order to function as a society, because we can't literally legislate and codify and lay down written rules to govern every aspect of our behavior. At a certain point, we do need to have unspoken rules of fair play. And with the crisis of Tiberius Gracchus, and then 10 years later, there's a follow-on to this, which is the crisis of his brother, Gaius Gracchus, who tries to do many of the same things that his brother did. And you just have this complete breakdown of all of those unwritten norms. And once you start losing those things, then anything starts to become possible. And what happened to Tiberius Gracchus, this is a small spoiler because it happens at the end of chapter 1, is the crisis that is set in motion by Tiberius Gracchus proposing a bill to redistribute land from the rich to the poor ends with Tiberius Gracchus being beaten to death with the leg of a table. That's the result of all of this. Is so when you start to have these breakdowns of, we're going to have a tribune veto this. Okay, well, I don't want the tribune to veto it, so I am going to vote to remove the tribune from power completely. None of these things had been done before, and it very rapidly accelerated to violence in the streets, perpetrated by both sides. And that event in about 130, 120 sets in motion what the rest of the book is building towards, which is political leaders start gathering together not just a few supporters with table legs, but entire armies with, javelins and arrows and swords and horses and siege equipment. And by the end of the book, you don't have sort of two factions clashing on the Capitoline Hill. You have entire armies battling it out in a civil war for the fate of the Republic entirely. So when I then look at the United States as it stands right now, and when you look at a character like Donald Trump, his whole MO is to find every place where only unwritten rules have previously bound our behavior and just run right past them. I think you see this a lot in the way that the Senate and the House of Representatives have been operating, that previous rules of conduct that used to govern comity, right? Fair play between the parties is just really being thrown out the window. And when you start to see those things happen, it's hard to put them back in place once they have been lost. Once you've sort of proven that you can effectively throw a rule out the window, and there was no rule against it. You can take little teeny tiny things like, obviously the Gorsuch, everything that had to do with the Supreme Court is a part of this. But you take, for example, President Trump's willingness to just appoint acting heads of things, the acting chief of staff and an acting head of the budget and an acting U.S. attorney, for example, that's just happening right now. And he's doing all of this because it does an end run around the advice and consent of the Senate, which is one of the critical checks and balances of the American Constitution. And once you figure out that if you just make somebody the acting head of something, and that means you can bypass senatorial oversight, well, then who's ever going to go back to senatorial oversight? Like, why, if you were the president, why would you ever then go back to putting things in front of your enemies for approval if you can just appoint people yourself? And now you start to lose all of the checks and balances that have kept things in power, because as it turns out, a lot of that stuff was built on unwritten rules of comity rather than really expressly constitutionally mandated written laws. So to answer your question, yeah, it's I'm seeing a lot of chapters 1 and chapters 2 and chapters 3 playing out in Washington D.C. and the streets of America, like right now.
All right. Well, we won't overload the parallels because, as you say, the history it's a fantastic work of history in its own right. We don't need to burden classical Roman history with too much Donald Trump, although I can't escape the idea of him in the back of a chariot wheeling around in a Colosseum full of adoring people, because I think he'd be great at that. He'd love it. So I wanted to move to a sort of slightly more positive, if you like, or the positive aspect of political change, which in a way is where you've gone with your next podcast on revolutions, and indeed I think your next book project, which you're working on now, which is a very new sort of non-traditional biography of the Marquis de Lafayette. So, and of course we're talking to people just before Independence Day weekend in America. So there's a revolutionary project that had a very good end and seemed to your point that you were just talking about, seemed very quickly to engage the idea of laying down some rules of behavior. It didn't quite trust on comity. It didn't presume comity would exist from the get-go. Those clever men, and they were mainly men, decided that they had better anticipate some bad behavior in the way that they set out the program for this new experiment, this new republic. How do you look at that era now, with against the background of the sweep of the revolutions that the podcast has allowed you to look at? Because I want to emphasize for people who haven't listened to your podcast that it starts in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution.
Oh, before that, it started with Cromwell. So it starts with the Bishops' Wars when Charles I decides to declare war on Scotland, even though he had no money. That's the revolutionary history of the entire European civilization begins when Charles I gets it in his head to start make them using the Book of Common Prayer.
So it's a big sweep through a lot of revolutions. The American Revolution is a pretty happy one by and large, yes?
Well, it's certainly the most it's the most conservative of the revolutions that I wind up talking about, because a great deal of what was going on in the American Revolution was declaring political independence from their former colonial mother country, right, is what's going on. But a lot of the existing social order that was existing in the United States at the time, or what was going to become the United States at the time, really kind of just continued forward. And so what a lot of the founding fathers were trying to do was to successfully break political sovereignty away from Britain and hold it in the United States, while also maintaining the existing land structures, the existing social structures, slavery, their expansion westward. They wanted to have these things be unchecked. So a lot of it, it's certainly the most conservative of all the revolutions that I wound up covering, because most of the people who were leading it were the social, economic, and political elite of the United States. So it's not one of those things where it's sort of a bottom-up social revolution, which you do start to get with the French Revolution. And then as I move on, when we're talking about the revolutions of 1848, or we're talking about the Paris Commune or the Russian Revolution, that's a lot of sort of like ground up, trying to overturn the social order, which didn't happen so much in the United States. Or, for example, the Haitian Revolution, which I did a 19-episode series on, which is the slaves overthrowing their white masters. Now you're talking about a real revolution. So with the United States, they successfully broke it away. And as you said, I mean, those guys who were in the Constitutional Convention, for example, they knew their Roman history very well. They knew their Greek history very well. I mean, they studied those ancient sources backwards and forwards. And so they knew about these things. And so the Constitution is actually far more explicit a written document than the Roman Republic was ever dealing with, or even that was governing the British at the time, because the British, famously don't have a written constitution. They just have this sort of accumulation of legal precedent and rules of order in Parliament. But James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were quite a bit more cynical about human nature than a lot of people were, and to a large extent, I think correctly, in terms of when they were putting together the Constitution, they said to themselves, anywhere that wealth and power accumulate, people are going to try to use that to become the wealthiest and the most wealthy and most powerful thing going. So if we can create countervailing areas of power where somebody else has a check or a balance, right, against the legislature or against the president or just against economic interests, because we have Congress has the power to regulate things. That as long as you can maintain those checks and balances, you're sort of working with this innate selfish desire to be the most powerful thing, kind of like a Nietzschean will to power. They were working to check that. And that contrasts very, I think, positively with what some of the French revolutionaries were trying to do, and especially Robespierre, where Robespierre was hoping to draft and create a constitution that would be successful because they had already turned the citizens of France into virtuous people and into virtuous citizens. So Robespierre's governing philosophy was, first, let's make everybody good, and then we'll have a constitution. Trying to make everybody good, especially people who are pursuing political power, is a very tall order. And it is not one that we have succeeded at, I think. And Robespierre did not succeed in making France into a king or a republic of virtuous citizens. And I think Madison and Hamilton and some of the authors of the Constitution successfully did an end run around that by saying, we don't have to worry about people being virtuous because we're going to set up a system that accounts for the selfishness of people, that accounts for the non-virtuousness of people. Unfortunately, there did come a point where you do have to let things go. As I said before, you can't literally write every single thing down. It's it's like when you have a kid. I have a couple of kids, and you do have to wind up making like weird rules. Like you can't take house plants and swirl them around your head. You didn't realize that you needed to make up a rule about taking houseplants out of the vase and swirling them around in your head, but you do. But sometimes you do have to just accept that people are going to work well together and accept each other and accept differences and not let it get out of hand, because we can't legislate everything away. So they did a great job, I think, channeling selfish cynicism. But you can't take care of everything, and if somebody comes along that wants to start breaking that, they can.
I want to say from us here at The Current to you, Mike Duncan, thank you so much for joining us. That was really wonderful, and happy Independence Day.
Hachette,